How's everybody doing tonight? Welcome to your favorite ray of sunshine. Yes. So, thank you for joining me tonight on Cup of Joe with Joe, Idaho Joe. Yes. And we're going to talk about a couple different topics tonight. Let's go ahead and pull those up, folks. Reminder, go to the Patreon, KRTD Media Group. Subscribe to the channel on Patreon. Same time, you can also go to our YouTube, our Facebook, our Twitter account. Go to all those locations, subscribe, find out what's going on with krtdmediagroup.com and how we're doing restructuring, reorganizing, and making independent media a thing that supports the people through discussion, education, the topics of the day. So, without ado, let's go ahead and get started on, helps if I actually pick the right one. Today, Wisconsin-based Thedacare loses court fight to keep healthcare staff who resigned. Okay, now this is an interesting situation. Reason why is because Thedacare, this is in Wisconsin. And Wisconsin is actually one of the relatively new states to the idea of right to work. Okay. Now, right to work, for it to exist, actually requires legislation to have occurred. Okay, right? This is legislation specifically regarding a group's ability for freedom of association. And the interesting thing about the way this has worked in years past is that it's always come out in favor of the employer. This is right to work at will, right to fire at will in most states. Now, in this particular case, where it comes into effect is Thedacare wasn't paying competitive wages to their nurses and various other medical staff. A competitor came in and said, you know what? We can pay you better. All you need to do is resign from Thedacare, come on over to us. We'll start you out at a higher wage. We'll start you off with better working conditions. We will provide everything that you want that Thedacare is not. And they were given a certain amount of time in which to accommodate the idea because the nurses, the medical staff were polite. They gave their notice and said, we're leaving unless you meet these certain criteria. And Thedacare decided they weren't going to meet it, so the staff resigned. In the process, Thedacare issued a suit banning all of their former workers from going to work for the competitive agency, competitive company, and forcing the workers to stay with Thedacare at a wage that the workers had decided was not appropriate. Now, like I said, under normal conditions, previous conditions, I should say, right to work has indeed always worked out in favor of the employer because it's made unions extremely difficult to operate in right to work states. Unions, freedom of association, and the freedom of the unions in order to set dues and whether or not an individual who worked with a company through freedom of association was, able to have benefits and wages negotiated on their behalf by the union. Okay. Right to work in most places says, yeah, you don't have to pay union dues, but if the union comes in and negotiates wages for one of their union members, they're negotiating for the entirety of the employees and staff, regardless of whether or not those people are paying union dues or not. Needless to say, it makes it a little bit difficult for unions to continue to operate because their expenses associated with negotiation are not being met. Again, different views regarding whether or not unions should be entitled to that or the freedom of association that comes with that. Where it comes into play in this particular case is Wisconsin is a right to work state. right to work at will, right to fire at will, which means when a worker no longer wants to work for someplace, they leave. No questions asked. They leave. Thedacare did not like that. In this case, it was a situation in which they went, well, union, put them to work. Oh, that's right. We're in Wisconsin in a right to work state, and the union can't keep them to work. That would be the normal situation in a union state like California, New York, or New Jersey, where the unions are still extremely strong. The employer could have gone to the union and said, can you keep them? In most cases where right to work exists, the idea is there is no competition. There is no one offering a better wage. There is no one creating, because they've either bought out the competition or they've regulated through regulatory capture the competition out of business. And there's no place else for these people to go. In this case, there was. And the competition was offering better wages, better working conditions, the whole 9 yards, and people left. Now, the judge in Wisconsin, and this I find absolutely hilarious because the judge should have known better. The judge said, no, you're going to go back to work for Thedacare. And that lasted all of about 2 days. At which point some other judge came in and went, no, 13th Amendment here, folks. You cannot force servitude on people unless they're serving time for crimes against the state. In this case, the nurses, they had no leverage over the nurses because the nurses weren't working in the hospital because they were prisoners. Yeah, they tried that. It didn't work. It got shut down. Thedacare now is understaffed, and they're running into issues with healthcare related, meeting the staffing requirements, being able to take care of their patients. And a lot of it was because they simply didn't meet the requirements. This is going to be a situation that's developing because Thedacare, because of the way they handled this particular situation, is going to run into risk in how the insurance companies associate with them and work with them, because Thedacare can no longer meet staffing requirements that insurance companies have determined are needed in order to continue work with this healthcare organization. Medicare and Medicaid, same situation. They're understaffed. They cannot meet the requirements for the accreditation of the hospital in order to continue operations unless they do something radical as far as increasing wages or find some way to attract staff back to work at this particular hospital. No, these hospitals. This is an interesting development because it has impact all across the United States right now. With COVID crisis care establishing itself in several locations across the United States, you're seeing hospitals, nursing care, healthcare organizations that are losing staff for a number of reasons. And not just because certain nurses have decided they don't want to get the vaccine, but for several other additional overworked, understaffed, underpaid. A lot of these nurses are beginning to realize that their value is significantly higher than what their healthcare organizations have been paying them over the last several years. They're looking for better negotiation. They're looking for better wages. They are looking for better options. And because of the crisis that's going on right now, we are seeing nurses and healthcare providers that are leaving the industry for jobs that pay better in other areas, leaving significant vacancies in hospitals and so on, where we continue to see this develop. Remember, folks, right to work, again, from a libertarian perspective, from my libertarian perspective, right to work was bogus because it required legislation in order to enact. Okay. Why did we need rules created to tell people how their freedom of associations can function? And whether this is regard to union, whether it's regard to union contracts with specific organizations, whether or not they choose to be part of a union contract or union organization. Okay. Freedom of association organizations have the opportunity to choose their specific rules, their codes of conduct, what a group, what an organization can or cannot do. When you go in and legislate right to work, whether that's right to fire at will, right to work at will, in this case, right to walk at will, you create a specific type of situation that is, well, it's not a free market, folks. Not by any stretch of the imagination. Let's go ahead and take a look at our next issue here. Okay, Alaska. Supreme Court upholds the ranked choice voting. This was an interesting dynamic when it came time for that. Now, ranked choice voting, they've been working on that pretty hardcore for the last couple of months or last couple of years. And Alaska isn't the only one that's done it. Maine has done it as well. Now, in both of these cases, both in Maine and Alaska, we've seen Supreme Court battles, well, at the state level, because that is where this exists. How you doing, Joe? Right, Brandy? You know, this is one of these things that we continue to see good things about, because the duopoly really does not like this. Not true. Within libertarian spheres and even within the Green Party sphere, there are certain people who don't like the idea of ranked choice voting because they believe that, it really should be a winner take all situation. Ranked choice voting sort of takes that away from the structure, takes it away from the voting organization, and takes it away from the voting system of systems. As we develop what's going on with those and we look at what's going on across the United States, we see ranked choice voting starting to appear in cities, on city ballots, particularly on issues where it is a at-large seats. Ranked choice voting sort of helps streamline the process. Doing good, Joe. Doing good. Let's go ahead and cover this. This is a throwback to the last issue, but nursing shortages, inadequate staffing. Okay. Just amend it. And this is about regulation. This is about regulatory capture, as far as what out here in Idaho is talking about. Regulatory capture, whether or not a hospital can be certified based on the number of nurses per patient bed. Back to the issue of ranked choice voting. Maine did it. Matter of fact, that was one of the things that Lisa Maine, who was running as an independent, was big on, was being able to be part of that initial test bed, being able to run on the idea that ranked choice voting was a way forward, particularly one that disempowered the way the duopoly did business, especially in Maine. Alaska, they've seen success. We are seeing several states that are trying to take it not just from the city and the municipal level, but actually moving it up through to county and state levels. We have organizations, drawing a blank at the moment, you're going to have to forgive me, on that are working to get ranked choice voting across the United States, in all of the states, so that it's no longer an issue of the winner take all. It's no longer the duopoly able to dominate the scenario, because now you can look at a situation going into it. You can say, okay, we have 5 candidates. Each one of these candidates comes with a different set of values, a different combination of values, a different approach. Now we're looking at a situation where now 5 candidates have to actually discuss the issues. Because if the 5th candidate, if one of the candidates doesn't get all of those votes, doesn't get the mandatory minimum of 50% plus 1, you now have an instant runoff. Lowest person taken out. Do they have it yet? No, next lowest. Take him out. Okay, with the recalculation, do we have somebody who makes a 50% plus 1 yet? No. And you keep doing the instant runoff until you finally achieve someone who has that 50% plus 1. This means you're looking at a process of cooperation, a process of networking, process of being nice to each other so that you don't ultimately alienate the clients or the constituents that want one of the other candidates. You're no longer coming in and saying all Democrats suck, because you may actually be in a position where some of those Democrats would have voted for you if you hadn't started throwing out the ad hominems. And this is one of those out here in Idaho LLC. Ranked choice voting. It's a great way to reduce election costs by eliminating runoffs. It also removes control of the parties of government. It makes every voter's voice relevant every time. You have the choice with your second, third, and fourth choice to determine which of those candidates is more likely to achieve success and achieve the seat that you're voting for. And again, like you mentioned, cost of runoff votes. We've run into that problem here in Idaho already a couple of times at the local level. A council seat or a mayor's seat. The first vote of the 11 candidates who decided to run for mayor didn't achieve a majority. Now, the thing is the top 2 now have to do the runoff, even though neither of the top 2 got more than 25%. All of those other candidates who might have been an option in the process have now just been left out in the cold. They're no longer able to participate in the election. They're no longer able to participate in representing you as a constituent because they've been eliminated, as you get ready to head into the final runoff, which again is costing money because the entire election has to be done over. It's a duplication of costs. A duplication of costs that weren't planned for in the normal process of good governance. Okay. So pay attention. Ranked choice voting. Take a look at what's going on in your state with it, because as we've seen, the Alaska Supreme Court has upheld what's going on with the Alaska ranked choice voting. Maine has upheld ranked choice voting as options. There's no reason to believe that your state, based on legislation, laws, and your state's constitution, will not see that ranked choice voting as a citizen's initiative, as a citizen's choice, as a citizen's ballot initiative, is feasible and preferred by the people of your state to the alternatives that are currently being made available with rather expensive primaries that are not paid by the parties. They are actually paid for out of public funds. Your state Republican primary being paid for with public funds. Your state Democrat primary being paid for with public funds. Your third parties, the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, Socialist Party of America, you know, they don't get the public funds in order to do that. They are not using your public funds in order to determine primaries. They're paying for those out of their own pocket. Assuming they actually have enough candidates for a given seat to justify a primary. But that is one of those things that we are looking at right now. Competition for seats from different party members in an organization. Oh yeah, let's go ahead and take a look at the Idaho situation. Okay, right now we have 4 candidates for governor under the Republican Party. 4. Okay, there is a good chance. Yeah, I'm going to bring this up, especially in the case of a single party controlled state. Primaries should be paid for and conducted by the parties. Okay. In this situation right now, Idaho is a red state. It is so red. We got a supermajority in the legislative body. We have everybody that's sitting in the executive branch are red. I mean, literally, this is GOP central. It has gotten so bad where here in Idaho, we have seen a fracture and factions develop within the Republican Party. I said to the point where we have 5 Republican candidates for the seat of governor. There is an extremely good chance that of those 5, none of them will actually achieve a 50% plus 1 during their primary. So what happens when you split a vote 5 ways? That means a runoff, which again will require, no, it may or may not. The Republican Party may decide that, you know what, 30% is enough to take the nomination. I don't know how many of you feel about that. 30% of the people who've decided who's going to represent you at the general election. We can do better. Ranked choice voting. It's an option. It's available. Consider it. Look for it. Next up. This one's going to be fun, folks. The controversy of Mars and the Ivory Coast child labor. Child labor. Last week, I actually talked about sex slavery, child sex slavery, and a number of issues that are associated with that. Child trafficking. This is one of those things. Now, an awful lot of people have linked the recent issue with the update, with the awakening of Mars and their M&M brand. And they've also tied it to the chocolate child labor crisis in several countries. Now, truth is, 2021, there were 8 children in the Ivory Coast that decided to sue Mars. And this case has actually already been heard and accepted and settled, probably about 3 or 4 months ago. So this rebranding of M&Ms at this moment comes well after the fact, but it is something that did exist. Mars was sued. They were part of a class action suit regarding child labor in several of these chocolate producing countries. Okay. Now, in a lot of these areas, what you're looking at with the transfer of labor, with what's going on, is children in rural areas are promised travel papers. They're promised a wage. They're promised an income, which they can then in turn take back to their family, which is the reason why an awful lot of these individual young children do it. They're promised these things only to show up at the farms, at the work sites. Yeah, they're given room and board, but that's it. They are not given a wage that allows them to send that money back home, which was the reason they went into the workforce in the first place. All definitions, this is slave labor. This is child slave labor. It is child trafficking because these children are recruited and sent to these locations in order to work on these farms for zero benefit, for zero reward for their labor. Now, Mars isn't the only one, right? Part we don't like to talk about, much like the undocumented immigrant labor problem, and that happens here in the United States. We're all responsible for this. We quietly demand slave labor so our consumer goods are cheap. Out here in Idaho, LLC absolutely hits this right on the head. Okay. Mars, Nestle, they participate in this. They turn a blind eye to what goes on with how the chocolate they purchase is acquired. And this is our fault because we, as consumers, turn a blind eye to the cost of what's associated with cheap production. Sam, I love this. Okay, some say the libertarians believe in child labor. Absolutely not. Particularly when it comes to situations like this. Okay, what it is the sovereign citizen, the child, the right to the right to informed consent. Will the child be treated well? Is the child able to participate through informed consent? Will the child be able to acquire property or capital through the work they do on their own behalf to enjoy the fruit of their labors? Now, in most cases where this situation exists, child labor is exploitative almost everywhere it exists. Some of the few exceptions I've seen is family owned, where the child is part of generating generational wealth in support of the family, in support of brothers and sisters, and being able to participate in enjoying the long-term fruits of their labor by generating family wealth. When you see children working in factories, when you see children being exploited at that level, more often than not, it is because of economic situations in which they're straight up being exploited. They have been provided, and people who are employing them are doing so with the intent of defrauding them. Joe Firestone, child labor. Okay. You address this issue here without here in Idaho. Okay. Children should be allowed to work, but unfortunately, we would need to have regulations to prevent abuse and exploitation. Okay. Now, that's one of those things where it's interesting because abuse and exploitation is problematic. It is problematic because right now we can't even prevent abuse and exploitation of people old enough to assume informed consent to work for several companies. Now, right now, we're dealing with an economic situation that is unique, in modern America. Right now, we are suffering a labor shortage. We've seen some states that have even gone so far as to reduce the ages at which child labor is acceptable, to reduce the standards under which child labor is acceptable. Um, in order to meet the labor market requirements. For the first time in a long time, we are actually able, as laborers, as labor, to dictate the value of our labor. And we no longer wait for an employer to decide, well, I'd pay you more than the minimum wage, but I don't have to, so I won't. We're now in a labor market where minimum wage has practically been eliminated as illegal standard in a lot of places. Idaho. Let's go ahead and take a look at Idaho. Okay, right now in Idaho, the legal minimum wage is $7.25. Think that through. The legal minimum wage in the state of Idaho is $7.25. As I go around and I look at signs saying we are hiring, okay, the minimum wage right now in Boise, Idaho, where I live, is effectively $14 an hour. You can walk into any fast food restaurant, you can walk into any business, any organization, and the minimum they're offering is 14 and a quarter. $7 above legal minimum wage. The market right now dictates labor value. It's a unique something that hasn't happened in nearly 40 years, folks. And it's interesting to watch the dynamics change. Let's take a look at this, Sam. It's a good distinction to make. Children should be able to work by choice and earn an income in some situations, but exploitation is always bad. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons. Some of the stories I heard, the kid at 15 gets a job working with his dad, at his dad's company. He's working there with his dad. His dad's able to provide supervision. His dad's there to coach him. His dad is there to pay attention to when the boss is taking advantage, to when the boss is exploiting the child. Now, most of our issues with regards to child exploitation, labor, and the labor laws actually go back, clear back to Pennsylvania, coal mines, the textile mills, at the turn of the century. God, I'm saying that turn of the century was only 20 years ago. The turn of the century, 120 years ago. This is when we were looking at the original child labor laws and why they came into being. It's because children were being put into hazardous situations. They were risking their lives. They were inhaling massive quantities of coal, working in the mines because they were able to crawl into the small spaces. They were getting cut and hurt working in the textile mills because they were small enough to climb under, the mills and the looms. They were running into these situations that were extremely dangerous. Now we're back in that situation again. Except thing is the United States isn't where this exploited child labor is occurring. Now, even though we're seeing it inch back in because the labor market demands, that's still not where the problem is. It's in the countries where we buy our products from, where we buy our input for our consumer goods from. Now, some of you, Green America, it's an interesting website. It's good. It gives a chocolate scorecard. Now, this particular scorecard comes from 2019, and it indicates which companies you can buy your chocolate from that encourage fair trade. And by fair trade, yes, Sam, absolutely. They were barbaric to children before those regulations, and unfortunately, because of the economic situations of the time, the families that put their children into those situations were easily exploited. The children were easily exploited. And now, since we can't do it here in the U.S., we outsource it. We do it where we can turn a blind eye because it's not happening to our children, to our kids. Yeah. But with regards to Green America, you want to find a place where you can respect the way in which your chocolate was acquired and the way in which your chocolate was sourced, whether or not the labor was fairly sourced in such a way that you can respect yourself for enjoying it. Go to Green America. Like I said, this one's a little bit outdated. As you can see, 2019, Mars only got a C+. Nestle, a little lower. Lindt, Hershey. Who else we got down there? Mondelez, Godiva. I don't know. As much as they charge for Godiva chocolate, I would have expected them to be able to source better. Go to Green America, take a look at their website, find out which companies actually participate in fair trade, which companies actually go out and evaluate the labor and the way in which their chocolate is sourced. Are they doing everything they can to do to make sure that the people who provide your chocolate are getting paid for their labor, are being fairly compensated for the time it takes them to make sure you enjoy your chocolate. And the thing is, it's not just chocolate. Pay attention. Fair trade coffee too. Enjoy your cup of Joe with fair trade. Okay. So let's go ahead and take a look at our next issue here. We're moving right along. U.S. Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer is retiring after serving nearly 2 decades. Okay, this one is particular interest. Reason why is because, as we all saw during the Ruth Bader Ginsburg issue, she was waiting for the first woman president to pick her replacement. And as a result, she ended up dying during the Trump administration, and Trump picked her replacement. A Republican Congress nominated her replacement. And, well, we all saw some of the fallout from that. Now, this is a situation. Justice Breyer is taking his time. He is looking at the situation. He's looking at what's going on. And he has decided that he wants to retire during a Democrat-ran administration so that a Democrat can choose his replacement on the Supreme Court. "20 years of service working on the Supreme Court, working as one of the liberal judges." And keep in mind that from a liberal perspective, him, Ruth, and the other judges did an awful lot to support human rights here in the United States. They did a lot to support civil rights, legal rights, issues with regards to how the police treated you, whether or not a court process was in the best interest of justice and the people involved. Justice Breyer was one of those who participated in the ruling, basically gave most of Oklahoma back to the indigenous tribes that were associated with it, particularly Tulsa, Oklahoma. But Judge Breyer is one of those. He's taking his time. He's chosen his time to retire, and he's chosen Joe Biden as the man to pick his replacement. We can give you guys a little bit of time to think on that, especially with regards to Joe Biden's record over the last 40 years in the Senate. Who, Joe Biden, during several stints sitting on the Senate Judiciary Committee, nominated several individuals who are currently, much like Justice Stephen Breyer, endorsed several Supreme Court justices who were nominated by Republican administrations. I gotta say, I admire Justice Breyer's faith that the system will replace him with someone who believes in rules and in support of the Constitution, as he does. Chutzpah, man. Chutzpah. Because honestly, I wouldn't trust Biden to replace me with someone that had such a sense of fair play. And yeah. But we are going to take a look. The justice is going to retire, which means right now we are going to start looking at who the Democrats will plan to replace Justice Stephen Breyer with over the next couple months. We will be looking at the hearings. We'll be looking at the number of things that go with that. And this is going to cover a broad spectrum of issues. Okay. We saw what happened with the previous two seatings, that were overseen by Trump. We've already seen some of the rulings that are associated with their placement on the court. We've seen libertarian perspectives that come back and said, you know what, maybe those particular justices weren't the best choice for maintaining and preserving the Constitution or liberty in the United States. Sometimes some of the rulings, seeing a couple libertarians come through and saying, okay, they did right. They did right. So pay attention. What's going on? The Senate Judiciary Committee will be the one that actually accepts the nominations from Joe Biden. Senate is still considered Republican owned. The chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee is a Republican. So again, pay attention to what's going on with regards to this replacement. Because honestly, what I expect to see happen is Joe Biden will select a nominee that the Republican Senate Judiciary Chair will find acceptable. In which case, we're looking at an even more authoritarian-centric Supreme Court of the United States than we have with Justice Stephen Breyer sitting on it. Okay. You can go ahead and move on. You can go back and we're going to cover back a few issues. Okay. Out here in Idaho, yes. Slaves is an inefficient economic model, as a fantastic illustration of modern slavery. We know slavery doesn't work. We know it's inefficient. We know that the capacity, the exploitation that occurs as the result of slavery, the theft of labor, the theft of the fruit of someone's labor is one of the reasons why, we as a republic, as a democratic representative republic, placed into our founding documents the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, most of us understand that at the time the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were written, yes, man, yes. At the time our founding documents were written, it was written by white Europeans. Okay. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with history as we actually dig back into history, but in 1705, the result of the Francis Bacon Rebellion, which happened in actually 1675, 76, somewhere around there, nearly 100 years before the Revolutionary War, Francis Bacon initiated a rebellion. Now, this was a multi-ethnic rebellion. This was indentured servants that were sent from Europe as part of the penal colony. Britain were sending Irish. They were sending indebted servants. They were sent to be indentured servants here in the United States because of peonage, serve off your sentence. Francis Bacon Rebellion was multicultural because not only did it have the indentured servants that were sent over from Ireland and the Welsh, and these were European-based heritages, European-based cultures that were brought over. But it was multi-ethnic because we were well entrenched in the African-American slave, or the South Atlantic slave trade at the time. And an awful lot of people of African heritage, of African ethnicities, had been brought over as part of the slave trade. Francis Bacon Rebellion actually united the European indentured servants along with the African slaves in rebelling at the time. Now, they actually succeeded temporarily because the British came back with more forces and put down the rebellion. But one of the results of the Francis Bacon Rebellion was that in 1705, the Virginia slave codes were written. These Virginia slave codes were written specifically to address the issue of dividing the descendants of the African slaves from the descendants of the European indentured servants and slaves. Slave codes defined race for the first time in the Americas. It defined and created anti-miscegenation laws. That was, the people of African heritage could not marry Ah, people of African heritage could not marry people of European heritage because we created anti-miscegenation laws as part of the Virginia Slave Codes of 1705. Said race entered into the situation in 1705. And in 1776 and 1784, when the founding documents for the United States of America were created, they carried over as part of case law the slave codes of 1705. Which was why you were looking at the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution of the United States. Pay attention to your history, folks. Our roots are not nearly as pure or as egalitarian as we wish they were, but the words that were spoken by our founding fathers applied equally to all citizens, to all residents of the United States. And if you pay attention to what goes on with regards to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, those founding concepts now reach globally around the world. That's how we fix our culture. That's how we fix our global community. Anyway, that's where I'm coming from. Absolutely love you guys. Pay attention to what's going on. And love you, Savage Joy. Love you, Savage Joy. Sam's going to take care of you in a moment. He's going to address the issue. I'll see. Overturning Wickard versus Filburn. Tens of thousands federal regs. We can go out. We can fix that. We can take care of those issues. Part of it is by going in and creating a Supreme Court that's willing to go back and roll back those decisions that have allowed the authoritarians to take so much control over the United States, our government, and our daily lives. Remember, folks, you are the power. Take that power, own that power. Family, friends, community. As long as you got those three, you can make anything happen. See you on the flip side, folks.